In 1994, Mauro Prosperi set out to conquer the Marathon des Sables, a 6-day ultramarathon that stretches across 151 miles of Sahara desert terrain. This race is notorious for pushing even the toughest athletes to their limits, but for Mauro, it turned into a battle far beyond exhaustion or heat stroke. As he sprinted across the desert, a sudden, violent sandstorm swallowed the landscape, and Mauro lost his way. What was supposed to be a calculated athletic feat became a horrifying nightmare. But don't get confused, he wasn't just any runner. Born in Italy, Mauro was a decorated athlete with a background in the modern pentathlon. The pentathlon, which consists of fencing, swimming, horse riding, pistol shooting, and cross-country running, had honed him into a highly adaptable athlete capable of pushing through mental and physical challenges. But despite his successes, Prosperi yearned for something more. That's when he discovered the Marathon des Sables. Known as one of the toughest foot races in the world, the Marathon des Sables drew elite athletes from all over the globe. Its setting in the heart of the Sahara Desert, with its harsh, unpredictable weather, made it a brutal challenge that few could conquer. The race demands self-sufficiency. If you want to participate, you must carry your own food and supplies while enduring extreme heat, grueling sand dunes, and days of complete isolation. For Mauro, this was exactly the kind of challenge he had been looking for. Confident in his athletic abilities and experience, he began training rigorously. He was determined to prove his strength in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. In April 1994, Mauro joined a group of over 100 athletes for the race of a lifetime. With the sun beating down on them, the competitors set off, knowing they faced 6 days of relentless desert terrain, but none could have predicted what's next. Despite the heat, Mauro was in high spirits. He had trained for this moment, and his confidence carried him through the first few stages of the race. Temperatures often soared past 50 degrees Celsius, but the athletes were prepared for that. What they weren't prepared for, however, was the desert itself. The first few days were taxing but manageable. Runners were spread out across the course, keeping pace as they tackled endless sand dunes, rocky stretches, and the overwhelming heat. Mauro, like many of the athletes, was used to tough conditions, but even he could feel the toll the race was taking on his body. Fatigue set in quickly. The combination of the dry desert air and limited water rations made every step feel heavier than the last. Still, Mauro pressed on, but as Mauro reached the 4th stage of the race, something unexpected happened: a sandstorm. Within moments, the clear blue sky turned a hazy shade of brown, and the wind began to whip sand in every direction. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the desert, which already seemed endless, now became a swirling nightmare of blinding sand and confusion. Mauro did what any rational person would do. He stopped running, covered his face with a scarf to protect himself from the biting sand, and waited for the storm to pass. Hours went by, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. In an ultramarathon like this, the race markers and checkpoints are vital, but in the middle of the storm, they were rendered useless. The runners were supposed to stick to the course, but without landmarks or visual guides, Mauro soon realized he had completely lost his way. What had been an adventure was now a fight for survival. With nothing but the vast Sahara surrounding him, Mauro had no idea where he was, no GPS to guide him, and no one in sight. When the sandstorm finally subsided, Mauro was left entirely alone in the vast, unforgiving Sahara. The storm had thrown him miles off course, and any trace of the race markers had vanished. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, the rolling dunes blending into the horizon. His compass was useless, as the storm had scrambled any sense of direction. Now, his only goal was survival. Prosperi knew the first 24 hours would be critical. He had only a few days' worth of water, enough to get him through the race, but not nearly enough to last him in the open desert. To conserve his energy and resources, Mauro decided to move slowly, traveling only in the early morning or late afternoon to avoid the deadly midday heat, when temperatures could rise above 50 degrees Celsius. During the hottest part of the day, he would dig a hole in the sand to shelter himself, trying to stay cool and out of the sun's blistering rays. The first few days of wandering were a blur of thirst and fatigue. His rations began to dwindle. Mauro's strategy was to head toward what he thought might be civilization. However, the Sahara plays tricks on the mind. Mirage after mirage teased him with the promise of water or shelter, only to disappear as he got closer. His body, already weakened from the exertion of the race, was deteriorating quickly. By the third day, it became painfully clear no one was coming to rescue him. The search parties had already started, but the Sahara Desert spans 3.6 million square miles, and Prosperi was just one man lost in its immensity. His hope of being found began to wane, and with each passing hour, his chances of survival dropped. He had to rely on his instincts, survival training, and sheer willpower to make it out alive. By the fourth day, Mauro's water had run out. Dehydration hit hard, and the symptoms were terrifying. His mouth was dry, his lips were cracked, and his muscles cramped violently. His body screamed for water, but the desert offered none. Mauro had no choice but to make a drastic decision. He would drink his own urine to stay alive. Drinking urine in a survival situation is a last resort, and Mauro knew it. Urine contains waste products that the body is trying to eliminate, and consuming it can be harmful in the long term. But in his situation, the short-term benefits outweighed the risks. He collected his urine in a small container and drank it, trying to stay hydrated enough to continue his search for help. His survival instincts kicked in further when, on the fifth day, he stumbled upon an abandoned Islamic shrine in the middle of the desert. The structure offered some much-needed shade and temporary relief from the brutal sun. Inside the shrine, Mauro made a grisly discovery: bats. In a state of near starvation, Mauro had no choice but to kill and eat the bats he found living in the shrine's walls. This was far from a nourishing meal, but it gave his body a tiny bit of protein and sustenance to keep going. The physical toll was devastating. Mauro was losing weight rapidly. He would eventually lose around 35 pounds during his ordeal. His body became skeletal, his skin burned and cracked under the relentless sun, and his muscles weakened to the point of collapse. But in the harshest moments of desperation, his will to survive was stronger than ever. On the sixth day, Mauro found a small oasis with a puddle of dirty water. This was his first taste of real water in days. And although it was murky and filled with insects, he drank it eagerly, knowing it might be his last chance to hydrate. His body was failing and his hope was diminishing, but Mauro refused to give up. He had faced unimaginable hardships, but the real battle was yet to come: the mental fight to hold on. By day 7, he was hallucinating, seeing visions of loved ones and hearing voices that weren't there. Every hour spent alone in the scorching desert wore down his spirit. At one point, Mauro considered the unthinkable. Believing that he would never be found, he decided to unalive himself. He used a small blade to cut his wrists, hoping to end his suffering, but the attempt failed. The extreme dehydration had caused his blood to thicken, preventing him from bleeding out. In that moment, something shifted inside him. Instead of giving up, Mauro found a renewed determination to live. He continued his trek, though barely able to stand at this point. His movements were slow, and every step felt like it could be his last. He focused on survival one moment at a time, one breath, one step. His mind was fighting against itself, oscillating between the desire to collapse and the primal instinct to keep moving. He thought of his wife, his children. The thought of them became his anchor, giving him a reason to keep going even when it felt impossible. On the 9th day, when he had reached the absolute limits of human endurance, Mauro's ordeal finally came to an end. A group of Tuareg nomads who were traversing the desert found him by chance. The Tuareg people, who are indigenous to the Sahara region, are experienced in surviving the desert's punishing conditions. The nomads immediately recognized the severity of his condition. They offered him water. The Tuareg then transported him to a nearby village where the authorities were alerted. From there, Mauro was flown to a hospital in Tindouf, Algeria, where medical teams were ready to treat his dire condition. When he was rescued, Mauro was 186 miles off course from where he had last been seen. Doctors at the hospital were astounded by his survival. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and his kidneys had begun to shut down from lack of water. Mauro's family, who had feared the worst after hearing about the sandstorm, rushed to his side. Reunited, they could barely believe the miracle that had unfolded. Mauro Prosperi's survival in the Sahara was nothing short of extraordinary, but it left lasting scars, both physical and emotional. Physically, it took months for Mauro to regain his strength. His kidneys, damaged from the severe dehydration, would never fully recover, leaving him with long-term health issues. Psychologically, Mauro described periods of intense nightmares and flashbacks to the days he spent wandering the desert, fighting for his life. For a while, the mental weight of those memories threatened to consume him. But Mauro's spirit was strong, just as it had been in the desert. He gradually began to find peace with what had happened. Remarkably, just a year after his near-fatal experience, Mauro decided to return to the Marathon des Sables. While some might have sworn off the desert forever, Mauro was determined to prove that he could overcome the trauma. He finished the race this time, completing the challenge that had nearly cost him his life. The Tuareg people, who are indigenous to the Sahara region, are experienced in surviving the desert's punishing conditions. The nomads immediately recognized the severity of his condition.